Hi. Welcome along. My name is Victoria Peat and welcome to the second instalment of the Spools of Thread Foundation Paper Piecing Sew Along. This week we are continuing on with the project. So it's great to have you here. I'm really pleased that you're here. I would be even more pleased if I was actually talking to you. Oh dear, what a day, not a great day. So thanks for joining me. If this is your first time coming along, I'll give you a bit of a roundup of what we've been doing and then we will dive straight into doing some foundation paper piecing basics. So last week, if you missed out, what we are doing is we are making a Spools of Thread mini wall hanging, and it's using foundation paper piecing techniques. And this sew along is to try and help those that are worried about foundation paper piecing. It's not something you've tried before, just to give you a few tips and techniques to help you go along the way. The pattern itself is available from my website. If you sign up for the newsletter, you can get a copy for absolutely nothing. If you're already a subscriber to the newsletter, there'll be a link in one of the latest newsletters where you can download a copy. But if you don't want to sign up for a newsletter, which I completely understand, you can just buy a copy from my website. So you've got those three different options for how you can get hold of the pattern. And so last week, what we covered off is we looked at how you get hold of the pattern and how you print it off. And we looked at how you cut out the pattern, and we sort of ran through a few bits and pieces in terms of what we were doing, the tools that we needed. We had a quick chat about fabrics, and yeah, that was about it. So it wasn't too much to begin with, but then I thought I'd just ease you in carefully, and then this week we can carry on and actually have a look at the foundation paper piecing skills. So for this week, if I just show you what's on my table at the moment, I haven't got my glasses on. I could do with some glasses today. Right, so what we're going to need today in order to do the foundation paper piecing is you may want a copy of your pattern. That's entirely up to you. You might have that, or you might just sew along with me, your choice. But the pattern is there and is a really good resource. You will need your pattern pieces that you cut out last week and prepared those. You will have 3 different pattern pieces in order to create each of the individual spools. You'll have the A, B and C pieces in order to create those spools. So you'll need those cut out and ready to go. You'll need a standard ruler. I'm using a 6.5 by 12.5 inch ruler. Nothing that's too big or unwieldy is what I'm using today. We'll need your add a quarter ruler, and I hope you've had a chance to see Swift Quilting website. She's got 20% off for anyone following along with the sew along. She has add a quarter ruler, so you can get 20% off one of those. We'll need a fabric glue pen. You'll need some pins and maybe a couple of sewing clips. It's up to you how you like to do your foundation paper piecing. You'll also need, which I completely forgot to mention last week, is an ironing surface of sorts. I'm using a woolen pressing mat, which I absolutely love. I really love it. Alistair is selling through, Natasha makes a really nice pressing mat that's from Savile Row wool, and it's what they use in Savile Row, and it looks brilliant. I've not used one before, but I'd really love to try one. So you could use your ironing board, but things like the pressing mat and my woolen pressing mat, they are brilliant. They really conduct the heat and give you really nice crisp seams, so they're really fabulous. So these are the tools you're going to need, yeah, someone mentioned, I think it was Sue, mentioned about a postcard for folding paper. So I'll talk about that. You can either have a postcard or have the little bit of packaging that goes in, that comes in with your add a quarter ruler. So to begin with, what we're going to do is I'll just show you some of the fabrics. Oh, first of all, why don't I show you what we're making today? So we're going to make these little spools. So you need to make, in total, you need to make 9 of those, and each one of these blocks here are one of these here. So each one has got your coloured section in the middle. You've got 2 background strips on either side, and the tops and bottoms, which are the B and C blocks, those have got a colour for the spools, depending on what you've chosen, plus a teeny tiny little piece of background fabric on each of those. So that's what we're going to be making today. We're going to be making, well, we're not going to make 9 of those, but I'll show you how to make one of those so that you can then go on and make some more. Okay, so let me just pull together the fabrics. If we have a quick look, I've got a slide here for you just to show you some of the fabric cutting. So within your instructions, you will see cutting instructions for your background fabric, which is here. I'm trying to change that over for you. Having a nightmare today. So here's your background fabric. These are your cutting instructions, and it will tell you how many to cut across a width of the fabric, and then it will be subcut into smaller pieces. Okay, so that's your cutting diagram for your background fabric, and then for this one here, this one is for your tops and bottoms of your spools, and you'll see on the pattern they're referred to as B and C pieces. They're those little tiny corner pieces that I told you about. You'll need to cut those, but you can also cut your binding fabric. So you just need to have a bit of a decision about how you want to colour your quilt, if you like. So on this one here, I've got these pieces here are exactly the same colour as my binding, but you might want to do two different colours for those. But if you're happy to do it all in one lot, you can get that from a fat quarter. It will depend very much on the size of your fat quarter. So just make sure that you've got enough space first before you start cutting. But what I would do is I would cut the binding first, and then you've got a little bit of space. You know, you've got a little bit of wiggle room on those B1, B4, etc. pieces to cut. So cut your binding first if you're doing it all in one go. Right, moving on, I'll just show you the fabrics once they've been cut up. Hello everyone, Jennifer was watching, thank you so much for watching. Lovely to have you, and Julie, you're here as well. Lovely, super duper. Right, if I just bring in, these are the fabrics that I have got. Haven't got enough hands. So the fabrics that we have cut out, from your background fabrics, I have got the sashing pieces. You've got the border pieces, and you've got some sashing, you've got some horizontal sashing, and you've got some vertical sashing pieces, and these are all out of the background fabric. So these pieces here, let me just flip over to the other screen. These pieces here are, you've got the 2 wide pieces, top and bottom. You've got your 2 wide pieces left and right, and then also from the background you've got 2 horizontal sashing strips here, and then you've got 6 smaller ones between the spools. So that's where those pieces have come from, or where they will go to. So these are these pieces here. So I'm going to just put those onto one side for the time being, because we're not going to need those today. We also have, these are my binding strips. I did decide that I'm going to go for the burgundy type colour instead of the black. So I've got a burgundy binding, and I'm going to put that on one side as well, because we're not going to use that this week. The other pieces that we have are, I have my coloured sections in the middle, and from memory I think they're 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches in size. I've also got a nice big stack here of the burgundy colour. These are your your C and B and C pieces for the ends of the spools. You've also got some little background squares and some other rectangles as well that you can use to create those spools. So those are all of your fabric. Can you hear there's a parrot outside? We live on a marina, and there's a guy, we're in Gibraltar, there's a guy, and he walks around and he's got cockatoos, which I don't quite get it, but he walks around, he's got cockatoos, and he's just chatting with some other people outside who are from New Zealand. Very odd, very strange. So if you can hear parrots, it's not me, it's the neighbours. Right, okay, so, we have all of our paper pattern pieces that we cut out. And what we need is, for each spool, we need 1A, 1B and 1C. And last week you saw how I took an A piece, a B piece and a C piece. And I drew on those. I had my colouring in diagram that I had here, and I just sort of made my rudimentary notes on which colours I wanted where in terms of my layout. And I wrote corresponding onto each of these pieces what I wanted where. Now what you can do is, when things start to get a little bit more complicated in foundation paper piecing, you'll get more and more pieces, and you can completely lose track of where you are. It just starts getting really complicated and you can't remember which tiny piece makes up what, because the way that foundation paper piecing patterns come together, they're not always very regimented and square or rectangular. Sometimes they're on an angle, and you start to lose an idea of which piece goes where. So it's sometimes a nice idea to actually colour in those pattern pieces. So what you could do is you could take some of your colouring in pencils or something and just colour in and say, okay, well this piece here that I've coloured in this fashion is going to be red, and so on. Whatever's going to make life easy for you. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start off with one of the red fabrics. So I've decided that this one's red. So I'm going to take a red piece, and for this we've got the red piece in the middle, and on either side we've got the background pieces. So we need two. Hi there, Erica, thanks for coming along and watching. Lovely to have you. Right, what I've done for this pattern, and you don't get it in all patterns, but in this pattern, because it was designed for beginners and for people to try foundation paper piecing for the first time, what I've done is I've given measurements for the size of each of these rectangles to cut out for your background fabric. You don't always get that with a pattern because some people deal with slightly different seam allowances and like to work in different ways. Sometimes when I'm dealing with foundation paper piecing, I'll actually cut from a much larger piece of fabric and I will trim as I go along, rather than cutting out lots of individual squares and rectangles. But for this, I've given you sizes for each of those, but there is wiggle room in those, so don't panic too much. Right, so to start off, what we need to do is we're going to start with your number one piece. Now, your number one piece always is attached to the paper, right sides facing down. So you need to always make sure that this fabric is facing away from the paper. What I'm going to do is, for this first piece, behind piece number one, and why don't I just, I will leave that for a minute. Behind this piece number one needs to sit exactly within the middle of this piece here, allowing, once you've attached it to everything else, there just needs a quarter of an inch seam allowance on each side of a solid line. So each side. So you wouldn't want to take this piece, and I'm just folding it back on this seam line, which is the solid line. You don't want to put it right up to the edge, because then you're not going to have a seam allowance. And I mean, you can put it further away, but what you can see here is that the fabric is not underneath the whole of that piece, the whole of that rectangle number one. So just start off by placing it in the middle. To secure it, I'm just going to put a dab of glue pen. I'm using a Soline glue pen for this. I'm sure you've seen these, they're absolutely super. Great for all sorts of bits and pieces. So I use those in foundation paper piecing. So I'm going to place that on the back of my, my coloured piece of fabric that I'm using for the centre of the spool. I'm then going to fold back along that line that we pre-folded in the last session. I find it easier to do it that way. If you haven't done that, you can use a postcard, or you can use the packaging that comes with your add a quarter ruler. Lay that against the parrot's going again. I wish I knew whether you could hear it or not. Let me know if you can, it's really funny. I placed that line, the edge of the card on the line between the 1 and the 2. So place that against that, and you can use that card to just press back along that line. You then take your add a quarter ruler, and what you want to do is you want to just trim this fabric here back, because this is probably a little bit too much fabric. It's not much more than a quarter of an inch, but it is probably more than you want. So I'm going to place that up against. So if you have your card, it gives you an extra little bit to push up against. But let me just see, the little lip on this, actually, should we just see, I've got another camera here on the sewing machine. Let me just see if I can show you here a little bit better. I'll just move it across the camera. I'm coming. So on here, can you see, that's probably about the best I can do for you. There's a little lip on the edge of the add a quarter ruler, and that lip sits up against the the seam allowance, or any seam that you've sewn, or this paper that you folded back. So pop that against there and you'll feel there's a little bit of resistance, and then you take your rotary cutter and then you just trim that excess fabric off, and you don't need that anymore, so you can just pop that in the bin. So that's your number one piece prepped and is ready now for sewing it to your background piece. So this is piece B2, so we've got A1 is the coloured piece, and then we're going to do A2 underneath. So I've got that folded back, I've got this line cut nice and straight, and then I'm going to place that on top of the background piece, and I'm going to lay it up onto, oh, I'm really sorry, I've not plugged in my charger. I'll be back in a minute, I'm coming, because if we lose charge then we're all stuck. We're plugged in. Okay, so what you want to be doing is adding that piece on top with your raw edges matching. And then we're going to take it across to the sewing machine. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew along the solid line. So we have here the solid line, you've got A1 and A2, and we're going to be sewing along that solid line. And I'm going to sew from this top edge all the way down to this bottom edge. The stitch length that I'm going to use is stitch length 1. You want to do something smaller than you would normally. So when you turn on your sewing machine, it frequently is sort of a 2.5 or something like that. You want to reduce your seam allowance, because what you want to be able to do is to remove these papers later. This paper is performing the function of creating a foundation and making it stable, and you know, the fabric doesn't move around, and you can create much more precise piecing. So I'm just stitching along, and then we get to the end. There's no need to reverse, I'm just cutting the threads and taking it out of the machine. So what we've got here is we've got our paper piece here, and we've got piece 1 and piece 2, and we've sewn on that solid line between the two. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to press this open here to press this fabric, piece number 2, away from piece number 1. So I'm making a mess already. Give that a press. And I do know that Swift Quilting have woolen pressing mats as well, so if you're interested in one of those, she's got those, got 20% off. Right, so now we have, we've got piece 1 and piece 2 attached together. We now need to attach piece number 3, so we're going to repeat the process. We're going to fold back on the line between 1 and 3, and we're going to trim off this excess fabric. So I'm just going to fold back against the line that I pressed earlier. I'm going to take my add-a-quarter ruler, butt that up against the paper, the fold that I've just made, and I'm going to trim off that excess. So now we know that this is 1/4 inch excess fabric, and it's a nice straight line, and I'm going to place that against the next piece of fabric. Now you can, if you like, you can stick a pin through here to secure one to the other, but I find that it disrupts the fabric a little bit, and it's a little bit tough to get through. The paper that I'm using for foundation paper piecing, which I frequently do, is just the bog standard stuff that I get out of the printer. I buy really cheap stuff, 80 GSM, and I sew through that. You can buy specific paper that's thinner for foundation paper piecing. It's worth a try, give it a go, see what you like, but for ease I tend to just go with whatever comes out of the printer. So we're going to sew again on that line, the solid line going between the two. Excuse me. And I've just gone from one end to the other. I'm going to cut my threads, and I've now got my third piece attached. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to press again and press away. So now we have your 3 pieces. So on the other side, on the pattern pieces, you'll remember on the week one sew along, there was the dashed line. The dashed line is where you want to cut your fabric to, because that's your 1/4 inch seam allowance that you will use in order to sew this piece onto any subsequent pieces. So what I now need to do is just tidy up this excess fabric so that it's cut to that line. So I'll use my ruler, and this is my slightly larger ruler. I always prefer to cut with a standard quilting ruler to trim these down in size. You can use your add a quarter ruler, but mine's quite an old add a quarter ruler, and I just want to show you, I've got an add an 1/8 ruler because this is slightly newer. This one has got like a chamfer at one end where it goes more narrow. You can use that, but I find that's a little bit too narrow, and there's a tendency to chopping a little bit off or shaving a little bit off with your rotary cutter. Don't ask me how I know that, but I do. So yes, I tend to just go back to a standard quilting ruler in order to trim my pieces down. And my ruler has a 1/4 inch line on it, and I'm lining that 1/4 inch up with the solid 1/4 inch on the piece. So I'm going to just trim those. This is where, if you have a rotating cutting mat, this is really useful because you don't have to, it's just a slightly quicker process, but for these videos I haven't quite got enough room to be able to add that in with everything else that I've got. I wanted to keep the screen slightly less cluttered, she says, looking around at the big fat mess on the table. Okay, and I'll just bin those. And that's where you have your finished A piece. Okay, so that one's a really great one to start off with because it's nice and simple. Okay, so we'll start with that. Next of all, what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the tops and bottoms of the spools. So these are these sections here. These are the B and C sections. They're both exactly the same as each other, so you don't need to worry about which one's which. Unless you want to do something really fancy with your colourways, then you don't need to worry. So for each of these, we need 2 of the larger rectangles, your B1 and B4, and C1 and C4. So we need 2 of those for each one. That's that one, that's that one. And then we need 2 of these background rectangles as well. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow exactly the same process as we did before. We're going to sew in order. So we've got piece B1. I'll bring this up a little bit closer so you can see it. So you've got on B, you've got 1, and then you've got B1, and then you've got 2 and 3 are the little background rectangles, and then you've got B4. So we're going to sew those in order. So we're going to start with B1. So on the reverse, I'm just going to put a little bit of glue to hold in place. I'm going to take the rectangle that I'm using for that piece, I'm going to place that printed side, right side down. The pattern piece I'm going to place on top, and again I'm going to remember just to make sure that I am the fabric underneath is poking out from the underside of the pattern piece. Just a little bit on this side, but just make sure that you've got from this solid line here, from when piece 1 and piece 4 get sewn together, just make sure that you've given yourself enough allowance on this side. So I'm going to just make sure that that's in the right place. What we're starting with though is we're going to sew between piece 1 and piece 2. So I'm going to fold back against that line that I pre-folded before, but you can press it back using your postcard if you prefer. And you can see how there's a whole lot of fabric here, and that for me becomes difficult to understand exactly where to place that underneath. So I think by using the add a quarter ruler, you can just neaten up that edge and gives you a nice straight edge and a guide as to where you need to put this piece of fabric. This is where things start to get a little bit more challenging because we're dealing with something on an angle. But what you need to do is you need to make sure, like I've said before, this rectangle sits entirely under this piece here that we folded back. Shall I bring this up? So this sort of not rectangular, what's this? Triangle. This triangular piece here, this piece of fabric needs to sit underneath. So I'm going to place that down, place the raw edges together, and I've made sure that the measurements that I've given you mean that this piece is big enough. But what you can do is, if you're dealing with scraps or anything else where you're not really sure about the rectangular sizes, or you're going sort of freestyle, what you can do is you can hold this up to a window, or you can use a light box or something, just to make sure that you can see through and make sure that that piece of fabric is covering, or is going to be sufficient enough to cover that piece. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold back this piece here, and we're going to sew on the line between 1 and 2. Okay, which is this one here. We're sewing between 1 and 2. And on here, you can see this, the solid line is where we need to stitch, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run this line of stitching. Ooh, wonky drawing. Hold on, I'll put it down. I'm just going to extend that line of stitching beyond through the seam allowance. You see there? And you can draw that line if you like. You don't need to, because you can see where you've creased the paper. Again, we've got a shorter seam allowance, stitch length, all the way through, and I'm not back stitching. Adding a back stitch in just means that things start to get really bulky. When things start to get a little bit further along and you're attaching more and more pieces together, it starts to just be far too bulky. So I'll press that flat, and then I'm going to press outward. Now, some people prefer, they might like to use a spray starch or a spray, stabilising spray, and use a seam roller, but I prefer to use the iron. It's up to you. Okay, so we've got here, oh, hi Joe, Joe's arrived, Joanne, hi, just back from the dentist. Oh, I hope you're all right. Oh, I need the dentist, I haven't been in ages. So we've got, you've got your piece 1 and your piece 2. We're going to come across and we're going to attach piece number 3, which is this other little bit here. Hi Lorraine, thanks for joining. Have you done foundation paper piecing before? Is it new, Lorraine? Let me know if you've got any questions, and I will try and answer as I go along. So what I've done is I've folded back between 1 and 3, and I'm trimming off that excess again. And then we take your background piece and attach on the underside of that one. So if you, your background pieces, I keep mentioning background pieces, but that's because these are solids, they're the same on either way. If this was a printed piece of fabric, you would need that right side up, which was probably key to mention, and probably should have mentioned it before now. But that would be right side uppermost. So I'm going to press, put the presser foot down, and then we're going to sew along that line, and again through the seam allowances, the line between 1 and 3. Okay, and then again we're just going to press that so that that one goes away from the burgundy piece. So you can start to see that coming together. Now we just need the other half of the end of that spool. Oh, Lorraine, you've had one go, lol. So one go, lol, does that mean you've had one go and it didn't go very well? Or it was hard? I don't know. Hopefully this, if you did have problems, hopefully this will help. Right, so what we need to do now is I'm going to press, I'm going to turn this back, the line between 1 and 4. I'm going to fold that back, but as you can see, there's just this little bit of stitching that we extended into the seam allowances. If you just, when you pull that back, if you just tear the bit of paper away, if I do that and then bring it up to the camera so you can see. If you just tear the fabric, the paper away from that little line of stitching, that's all you need to do. So we'll put that down, take the add a quarter ruler, trim off the excess and get rid of that. So again, we've got that nice straight line, 1/4 of an inch, and we're going to place that against the remaining piece, right sides together. So again, this is not a solid, so the right side is uppermost. I'm going to take that over to the machine, Flip the paper open and we're sewing down that solid line. Again, you can sew through the seam allowance. Now when things start to get a little bit more complex, you may want to stop at the very end of one of those solid lines, but because this is quite simple, we can just sew all the way through. Oh, hi Sally Ann. Oh, thanks for watching. Oh, it's so lovely having other people come along and watch, people that you work with. It's really nice. Have you seen Sally Ann hosts lots of stitching cruises? Oh, they look really super. I'd love to go on one of those. Although Derek Marks, now anyone who's watched Sewing Quarter in the past will have seen Derek Marks. He's one of the presenters. He also presents on Cruise TV, and I think they're struggling, because I watched him the other day because it just popped up on Facebook. You know how it does. He was on there, and there was a really amazing deal, and I'm thinking, oh, cruises may not be going very well, because the deal was amazing. I nearly booked, absolutely nearly booked. Right, okay, focus. Right, so we've sewn here, and now we need to sew iron across to flip that piece out. I keep thinking I need to move that because I'm going to melt my lid for my pen. Give that a little press. Now, ideally, what I would do is I would leave that on here, maybe with a little weight on it or something, just to let that cool, because the wool pressing mat really does create lovely sharp seams. Right, so what we have here is we have our piece with piece number 1, 2 and 3 and number 4 attached. So on the other side, just so that you can see that, you can see the fabric extends out further than the paper, which is good, that's what we want. So now we're just going to go and use my standard ruler, and we're going to trim that down in size. Not that one. Listen to yourself. Lorraine says, went okay-ish. I'm learning lots today. Oh, thank you. I hope so. I hope I remember to mention all the tips as I go along. And there are ways and means of working things out as you go along as to what works for you. And you can see today I'm sewing standing up, which is a little skill that I learned when doing Sewing Quarter. But generally speaking, when I'm normally sewing, I will create myself a little bit of a station. That means that my sewing machine, my cutting surface and my pressing surface are all relatively close to each other, because you'll find that what you're doing is repeated processes over and over again, and the last thing you want to do is to have your ironing board on a completely different floor of the house, unless you're trying to get your steps up for the day. If you're trying to get your steps up for the day, then that's a different matter. That's absolutely fine. Just go for it. Put them all over the place. But I like to have everything kind of in one place, so that you're minimising how much moving around you're doing. Right, so that is the end of the spool that we've created. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make one more of these, and I'll try and be a little bit quicker this time round, so then you can see what it looks like when they all come together. Okay, so we've got piece C. You need to do C1. Take my sew line glue pen, a little dab of that, place my fabric right sides down. Let's go this way, no, let's go this way. And we're going to sew between 1 and 2, fold that back, and hi Simone, lovely to have you with us today. Have you made a start? Are you sewing along? Are you thinking about it? Have you ever done foundation paper piecing before? I'd love to know. It's great. The amount of messages I've had this week is really heartwarming. It's really lovely. And you know, I don't know if you caught me saying, I said to my husband, oh, I'm thinking of doing a sew along, and he thought, well, I'm not sure people are going to be that interested. And I mean, he is one of my biggest supporters, so don't make that sound like it's, you know, him being not supportive. He was just thinking, oh, will people join in? And we've just been astounded, really, really pleased that all the messages and the amount of people that have downloaded a copy of the pattern is just wonderful, really lovely. Oh, everyone will be foundation paper piecing in no time. Right, so I've done pieces 1 and 2, let's go for 3. So we're going to fold back along that line, trim off to get the straight edge. Always be careful with your rotary blade, always make sure that your blade is away. Joan, good luck. This is what this video is for. Joan has got all of her pieces cut and ready to sew. So hopefully this will be useful and you'll be able to start getting them sewn together. So between the two line, along the line to get that piece of 3 in place. Would you like to see that rather than just me sewing away? There we go. Letting the side down. See, I can't do everything. It's really difficult to try and talk and sew and change the cameras all at once. I need a clicking assistant who will come and click everything for me. See, maybe I should do this when the children are off school, because then I can teach them how to direct. Little Paul, who was a fab director and producer that worked at Sewing Quarter and he's now at Sewing Street. I should get him to come and do a training session. He's got a friend that lives in Gibraltar, so maybe I can convince him next time he's over to come and train the children on how to do directing, and they can click all the buttons for me. Right, so your final piece here, right sides up, place that right sides together, making sure that the fabric extends past the pieces of paper. Oh, Jennifer, what have you done? Says, oops, just messed up second part. What are you doing? You're not paying attention. Is it me? I will blame it on me because I'm not changing my cameras often enough. Shall we do that? Sorry, Jennifer. That is what our friend the unpicker is for. Or, you know what, because you're just printing it out on your printer at home, just print out a new one. I think sometimes with foundation paper piecing, life is too short to try and unpick these teeny tiny stitches. So just start again. Get a new piece of fabric, assuming you've got a bit more fabric, and just start again, because yeah, unpicking is can be quite painful. Right, we'll press that last piece. And press that back. Yeah, I didn't have my seam roller. I left that in England, so I don't have a seam roller I can show you. But they are super. They're really great for foundation paper piecing. Oh, Simone's messaged and said, can I watch on YouTube live? Then I can watch you on the big screen. And no, see, right, this is me being small scale. You can stream, as far as I know, unless someone can tell me otherwise, you can stream live to Facebook or you can stream live to YouTube. But if you want to stream live to both, it's a subscription model and you have to pay someone money to do that. And I'm not. It sounds terrible, but well, to be honest, I'm not in a position where I can start to pay for things like that. Maybe if I get lots and lots of followers, hint, 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 hint. So if you'd like to subscribe to the channel, when I've downloaded it onto, or uploaded it even onto YouTube, if I get loads more followers, then maybe that will all change. Who knows? Who knows? Right, okay, the bit that we're going to do next is, let me show you. We are going to, what we've got now is we have got, not enough hands is what we've got. So we've got the 3 different pieces that we have made, and we're going to join those together to make a spool. Okay, so what we need now is, this is where your pins come in handy. And do you like my pin cushion? Just a bit of a cross promotion. I've designed this. This is English paper piecing. This is the Pentapini pin cushion, and you can buy a PDF download or a paper pattern or a kit. So just if you would like one of those, you can see my website. Right, so what you need is some pins, and the pins that I mentioned, I think I mentioned last week, it was a long time ago, are glass head quilters pins. I find these really, really useful. I also quite like the Clover flower head pins, because they're also nice and long and quite thin. But generally speaking, I tend to gravitate towards the glass headed pins because they're a little bit thicker and less likely to bend. What I need, you'll need several pins. What I do now is, what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure we're as accurate as possible when we're joining these seams. So you can see here, this is a seam that you would like to get nice and sharp. So you'd like this join to be close. They're all pretty bad. They're all pretty good. They're not too bad. So what we're trying to do is we're aiming for this piece here to join nice and sharply. And what I'll do is I'll bring with me next week. I'll show you some of my other foundation paper piecing projects so that you can see where that becomes, or how that becomes important. So what I'll do is I'll take my pin and I'm going to put it through the junction between 1 and 2 and I'm going to place it on the seam allowance, so 1/4 of an inch from this outside edge. I'm going to put a pin all the way through. I'm going to poke it all the way through to the other side. And what I'm looking for, oh, that was good, that doesn't always happen, is you're trying to make sure, bit of self-congratulation, is you're trying to make sure that the pin comes out at the junction between these two pieces. You don't want it coming out, for this particular pattern, you don't want it coming out on this white section or the background section, because that's when you won't join up nice and neatly. So I'm going to repeat that on this side here. So a pin through. Oh yeah, that one's worked as well. And then I'm going to take the corresponding piece that I need to sew to the top. Oh, hold it the right way up. This piece that I need to sew to the top, on the flip side, it is, if I draw a circle for you, it's the junction where those two circles are. So I'm going to push a pin through those, and this one's a little bit more challenging, and just have a look on the other side as to where that's going to come out. Not quite. You just shuffle a few stitches to the left or the right just to make sure that it's going through where you want it to. So I've got my 2 pins in each of my pieces. I then do a bit of jiggery pokery with the pieces, and I'll hold, for me I find the bigger piece easier to hold on the bottom, and then I'm going to place these right sides together. So what I'll do is I will take this pin out of the bigger piece on the underside, and I'm going to watch where it comes out of. Don't worry about it, it'll be okay. You pull that out and you can just see the little hole that's been left. And you take this pin on the top piece and you poke it through that hole. So that's gone through. So now you know that that pin, when it's held perpendicular through there, that those 2 pieces are nice and neatly joined up. Okay, the next piece you've got here is on the underside. We're going to take this piece out and we're going to poke the top pin through. So through that hole, and sometimes if you lose where you're going, you can just hold it up to the light to see where that's going. Okay. Okie dokes. Oh, Lorraine, someone's gifted you an add a quarter ruler. That's nice. Oh, I like that. Love a gift. Right, so those are through, nice and perpendicular. This is where I bring in my sewing clips, and I'll just take a couple. It depends on the size of piece of work that you're working on as to how many sewing clips you use. And I like to place those just up against that seam line. So for this, I'm only going to use 2 clips, and I'm going to take out that pin just for the time being. And then I'm going to take that across the sewing machine. And then you sew along this solid line on this far edge. Now, if you're not sure and you're doing something a little bit more complicated, what you can do is you can increase your stitch length along here and check what you're doing. What I would say is don't go too long, because if you start to go too long with your stitching, your machine moves too much and it can move this and make it go all wonky. So I'll just increase it to something like a 3, something that's a little bit easier, maybe a 3.5, just something that's easier to unpick should you be unhappy with the way that these 2 pieces have come together. I'll then take this pin out, pop it under the sewing machine, and sew along that solid line. Again, no need to reverse, and just take out your sewing clips as you go along. Okay, and then if we go back, and then we'll have a look at this and decide, okay, I've gone along here, and what you'll be able to see, actually, would it be easier if I go back on this one? So what you can see is I've done a row of stitching that's gone along that solid line, and ideally when you flip it over it should actually mirror image on this other side, and that will make you comfortable that actually you're sewing as the pattern intends, and it should come out pretty well. So if we open this out and we press, I tend to press away from where the bulk is. So for this pattern I would press this towards this main section. You can press back that way, but you can see these pieces are quite little, and if I just finger press it a little bit, you can see here how this junction here doesn't look as great as if you pressed it back this way, because there's this little turn of cloth here, and it just sits a little bit better. So it's, some patterns will be prescribed as to which direction you you press in, and some won't be. So just have a little look, press it one way and then press it the other, and just see what you're most comfortable with. But if you've sewn that on the longer stitch length, what you need to do is then go back and sew with a shorter stitch length, because otherwise getting those papers out is going to be more challenging. And we'll talk more about papers next week, because we're going to do the construction next week, and that's when we'll be removing papers. Right. So we've got that piece here, and you can give that a press. Joan, thank you for your message. Yes, you'll be able to watch on YouTube later. I'll just need to upload that later on. It might be later tonight, because look at the time, 2:15. 2:15 in Gibraltar, not in the UK, don't panic. I'll have to go and collect the children from school soon. But yes, I will upload that. Jennifer, let me see your message. Jennifer, need a brain scan, did the body and top and forgot already how to do... Oh, Jennifer, that's what the video is for. You can go back and remember how to do it. Right, so we're going to attach the next piece. So we've got the bottom on, so we're getting the spools coming together. We're going to attach the bottom in the same way. Stick your pins through to try and get those seam junctions as accurate as possible. Because the point of foundation paper piecing is to create either really sharp patchwork projects, or something a bit more pictorial. So things like these spools, or I've got a heart, and I have a kingfisher, and of course my nutcracker. They're all things that require slightly less traditional piecing techniques, because to try and do that without foundation paper piecing, I think becomes really difficult. Okay, so I've got my pins through those holes. I'm going to take the bigger piece on the underside, that's got the pins in it as well. Hold that in one hand. Remove that pin, stick the other pin through. Oh, missed. All that effort and I miss. And then take the other pin out the lower piece and stick the pin back through the hole from the upper piece. Oh. Now, in theory, you should just be able to stick them right sides together and the paper should just match up, and it does, but sometimes I think when you're doing more complicated pieces, or there are triangular pieces, to be able to use this method and to understand this technique, that will help you when things start to get a little bit more complicated. So get my sewing kit, clips. There we go. And take that pin out. Oop. And come over to the machine. I'll swap the camera over for you. So I'm now just going to sew. I'm just going to wing it for this one. I'm just going to go with a shorter seam allowance. And sew. Just try and be as accurate as possible. Get along that line, because when you're dealing with foundation paper piecing, the pieces are very small. They're not always small, but more often than not they're small. So to go off those lines will mean that you go a little bit skew-iff and wonky, and the pattern won't necessarily come together as intended. Okie dokes. Right, so now we've got this piece C on, and we're just going to press that away. Now, one thing you need to bear in mind is when you're pressing, depending on your printer and what you're using, laser printer, colour printer, inkjet printer, just be careful that sometimes your iron can pick up some of the print on the paper, because more often than not I am tempted to press and then open, because that's traditionally what you do, is you press the seams flat to set them and then open them out. But for this, sometimes just be careful, particularly when you're dealing with lighter fabrics. Excuse me. You don't want to be transferring any of that ink onto your sewing. Okay, give that a press. Okay, And there is your spool. That's your spool all finished. Then what you need to do is you need to make 9 of those. So like we have in the pattern here. Oh, just knocked a camera. No, I'm just losing it today. So you need to make 9 of these. So you've got your colouring in diagram that you're referring to, and you've got all 9 of these that you're going to make. Now what you can do, and who was it that mentioned, was it Hannah? Yeah, she's saying, would you chain piece? Yeah, absolutely. What I'll do is between now and next week, I'll make the rest of these and I will chain piece those. So what I'll do is I will do on the A section here where you've got A1 and 2, I'll just line up the rest, the final 7 of those, and I'll just chain piece those. But to begin with, if this is your first project, don't do that. Just do one section at a time and then join the sections together and just do one. Just completely do one spool first and then check that you're happy with it. And when you're happy with it, you'll gain a little bit more confidence. And then you might want to do it. But Jennifer, don't. One at a time. Just do one at a time. Just do whatever you're comfortable with. That's like that with so much of patchwork and quilting and dressmaking. It's just do what's comfortable for you. And you'll get better results and you'll feel happy about the process. Right. So those are your spools. So have a go with those and sew those between now and next week. Next week what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at, we'll do a quick recap on how to do these, and then we'll start to talk about how we join these together with the other pieces. So we'll run through that. Right, what else did I need to tell you today? Change your needle. So if you're sewing these, and you're working on other projects at the same time, the sewing machine needle that you're using will become blunt because it's going through the paper. So don't then go and try and sew on some beautiful Liberty fabric or something else gorgeous, because you're likely to snag the fabric. Take the needle out and save it for the next time you're doing foundation paper piecing, or just bin it and get a new one. But either way, don't use that for anything else. Don't forget that Emma Bradford at Swift Quilting, she's got a discount for everybody watching. It's a 20% off at Swift Quilting Company. If you use the code LBD20, you will get a discount, and she's extended that through till the 30th of March, which is super. So if you do need anything, things like the pressing mat, or you need some new blades for your rotary cutter, you need some pins, maybe she's got Soline glue pens, but I know she did have the add a quarter rulers. So if that's something that you think you need, then do stock up. One last thing I wanted to show you before you go, for anyone that is more advanced at foundation paper piecing, I know this is a basic project, but I thought it would be really lovely to try and do something a little bit more challenging. Now what I did is completely and utterly took off a bit of more than I can chew, because I'm looking at it and just going, what was I thinking? But I am coming up with an alphabet. Here is an E. Mini alphabet. There is an E and there is a C so far that I have sewn up, and these are made to be the right size to fit in the middle of these spools. So you could do something with some initials, or you could do a little alphabet, or you could use these on the side of a bag or another project. I thought it would be really lovely to be able to personalise the inside of these. So keep an eye out for them. They are more challenging. This is where my add an 1/8 ruler, this is where this comes in really handy, because when you are trimming these seam allowances, when you're piecing the foundation paper piecing blocks, to have an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance makes a massive difference, because otherwise there'll be so much bulk you wouldn't get in. So yes, I'm doing those. So let me know what you think about the alphabet, and whether you think you'd like that, because I can pull together a pattern for those. Let me just quickly check a couple of messages. Lorraine, great tips, thank you. I love watching you. Give this a go on Saturday when I'm grandchildren free. Yes, grandchildren do not help. They will not be useful, because you need to be just remembering right sides together with the fabric and cutting off your 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So no grandchildren. Erica Lloyd, I'm new to quilting. I've been told to use a grey thread. Is that what you recommend? And also, which is the best brand to use? In terms of thread, today I'm just using a Gutermann thread, but you might want to use something like an Aurifil or something lightweight. And in terms of colour, yeah, more often than not I am using a mid-grey kind of colour. Maybe I'll get some threads for next week just to show you the kind of colours that I use. But it will depend on the project. So if you're doing something that's got lots of blues in it, then I would choose something on the blue side of things, and reds I'd go something more on the red type side. So just have a bit of a think about the fabrics that you're using and which colour thread is going to likely to blend in, because, you know, to be honest, in some seams you will see that stitching just a little bit where you're pressing back. Let's see who else. Mandy, love the alphabet. Oh good, that's one taker. Some of them are really complicated, some of them are really easy. The E, things like the E, that's not too difficult, but when you start getting onto the curved letters, there have been some head scratching, I'll tell you. And Amanda Jenkins, I'd like you to do a dog blog. Oh my word. All right, I'll add that to the list. And Lorraine says she uses grey or cream. Yeah, just something relatively neutral would be super. And let me see, Marilyn, thank you, brilliant demo, see you next week. Yeah, I think that's it for me for this week. Thank you so much for coming along. I really appreciate all the feedback and all the messages. If you've got any questions, let me know. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. And if you need a copy of the pattern, subscribe to the newsletter and you will automatically get a copy in your inbox. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon. Bye.